I want to introduce the speaker for the morning. Our speaker right here is Bill Heffernan, and I understand he has spoken here before, so I'll say welcome back. Bill teaches at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He's also an editor of Criminal Justice Ethics, a publication of the college's Institute for Criminal Justice Ethics. But the best part of this introduction is the title of his talk. The title of his talk is quite awesome. It is Amazing Grace, Tagging Along with Cordelia, Jane Bennet, and SpongeBob SquarePants in their adventures beyond the justice zone, with concluding ruminations on Nelson Mandela's fusion of justice and personal grace. That's the title. So with that, you're on.
Am I on with this now?
On
Is it working?
screen,
I've turned it on.
It sounds good.
I hope it's working. So let's see. Okay. Now,
There you go.
I'm very grateful to be asked back. I talked to you at Mark Bernstein's suggestion more than 30 years ago when my daughter Sarah, who is in the room here, was 4 and came. And now my son Michael is here as well, along with my wife Denise. So I'm very grateful that you are willing to listen to me again. And let's see what I can do with it. Now, I think you'll probably recognize at least some of the names in my subtitle. And if you may recognize all of them. But by themselves, the names are unlikely to mean much without an explanation of the spatial imagery that I use to think about the 3 fictional characters, Cordelia, Jane Bennet, and SpongeBob SquarePants I mentioned, and 1 human being, Nelson Mandela. My spatial imagery presupposes a landscape of ethics, a justice zone, as I call it. We can make sense of human conduct, I think, by locating it within and beyond this zone. If within, all well and good. If beyond, the conclusion, the verdict, we might say, is troubling whenever the conduct is unjust. On the other hand, the conclusion, and here we would use the word verdict, is favorable if the conduct is placed on the plus side of the justice zone. For then the person under consideration has exceeded the requisites of justice by doing something of unusual moral value. Our vocabulary is sparse for thinking about the kind of exemplary behavior that I'm concerned with. I'm going to use the word grace to talk about it. In a moment, I'll alert you to the difficulties associated with any effort to think about the plus side of justice. For the moment, it's enough to tell you that my 3 fictional characters and the one from real life all help us think about this ethical terrain on the plus side of justice. Now, here's a straightforward introduction to my map of the ethical terrain. I understand the term justice to be the master concept for thinking about the fair terms of social cooperation. The content of these terms is contestable. The starting point for thinking about them isn't particularly difficult, though, for reflection on justice begins with the notion of reciprocity, with treating others as we would have them treat us. Now, I have a series of quotations in the sheets that my son distributed for you, and you'll probably be able to follow this along with that. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, the Torah states. If we look for an equivalent statement in the modern world, we find Abraham Lincoln appealing to reciprocity in the same way when he remarks, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." Each comment begins with self-love. Each builds out from this by treating self-interest, not self-interest alone, of course, but reciprocity of interest, as one person acknowledges the legitimacy of others' expectation of respect for their interests. as the measure for determining social obligations. We can make sense of this by saying that the concept of justice doesn't presuppose saintliness. And it also doesn't presuppose love. Justice is a concept for wary cooperators. It's a concept pertinent to interaction among strangers, a concept that can be used to identify rules and principles essential to mutually advantageous exchange, not a concept that necessarily promotes affection between people. As this point suggests, justice is concerned with duties. That is, the duties rationally self-interested people would acknowledge as obligations to others, provided others will also acknowledge these obligations as binding on them. On this reckoning, justice is a relatively demanding affair. It isn't impossibly demanding. We're not concerned with the terms of interaction in a community of saints, after all, nor are we concerned with the lyrical terms of a love match. Rather, we're concerned with a concept suitable for higher primates capable of self-regulation who are routinely beset by temptations that, if satisfied, will undermine the terms of fair cooperation. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about the terrain beyond justice, about justice plus, as we might call it. This doesn't mean, though, that I don't value justice itself. Next quotation I have. Nobody is beyond justice, the legal philosopher Jeremy Waldron remarks. We're entitled to the full benefit of the principles of justice, and we're all subject as respondents to the burdens and requisites of justice. I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. But in today's talk, I'm going to consider something more, something that isn't quite as grim as the dutiful etiquette of reciprocal obligation, something that doesn't merely require self-discipline essential to doing one's duty, but something that's also good. Indeed, better than good, since it's not merely satisfactory, but exemplary. Now, is grace the right term for thinking about this? I'm not sure. Our vocabulary is threadbare once we turn to the positive side of justice. Philosophers use the term, this is getting fancy, supererogation in this context. And I provided a dictionary definition of this unfamiliar word, i.e., the act of performing more than duty, obligation, or need. John Rawls, arguably the most important 20th century philosopher to write about justice, uses supererogation in just this way when he remarks, and again, it's all in the quotations, the love of mankind is more comprehensive than the sense of justice and prompts acts of supererogation, whereas the latter does not. I think this is sound, and yet Rawls's dry prose leaves us uncertain about the mindset of justice plus. Is it merely an abstract entity, this love of mankind that's at stake here? And also the motivating mechanism for justice plus. What prompts people to go beyond duty? In particular, what prompts this in a higher primate, given that primate's attunement to his or her self-interest? My term grace is perhaps helpful here, for it suggests something mysterious that lies beyond the transactional world of wary cooperation. But the word grace comes with heavy baggage. That baggage is theological. Charisma has a Greek root, and St. Paul drew on this in his epistles to the Christian communities, while translators from the King James Version onwards have rendered Paul's term as grace. And the baggage is secular as well. This is because Max Weber, an early 20th century sociologist, relied on the term charisma to propose a concept that helps clarify how some leaders use their magical hold on the public to undermine legal rationality and even justice. After all, many charismatic authoritarians, Hitler for instance, have persuaded their followers to engage acts in of stupendous horror. Because charisma is used in both its early theological setting and its modern secular one to refer to an unearned personal gift, to a characteristic its possessor did nothing to merit, a characteristic someone is simply born with, it's essential to tread carefully when using grace to think about justice plus. I'm nonetheless going to tread here. My comments will rely more on St. Paul's use of the term than on Max Weber's, though I'm going to return to Weber on charisma when I talk about Nelson Mandela at the end. Paul, like Weber, treats charisma, grace, as something unearned, but Paul, of course, views it as a spiritual gift, an unmerited gift bestowed by God. There's nothing just about this bestowal, someone would say. It's not because people have made sacrifices to God that they receive the gift of grace. That may have been the way in which people related to God at an earlier time, a time when something valuable was offered up so as to earn God's favor, a lamb, for instance, or even the life of a much-loved son, as in the case of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac. But with the coming of Christ, we can now see that God freely bestows spiritual gifts on the human race. And what are these gifts? The passage from Paul's letter to the Galatians that accompanies this talk provides an inventory. Paul writes, "The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance." These are all features of justice plus. I've already noted that love isn't essential to justice. I'll now add that the other terms Paul mentions in Galatians also aren't essential. Mutually advantageous exchange is possible in the absence of all of them. And indeed, we can add terms that aren't mentioned in Paul's inventory: kindness, agreeableness, amiability, consideration, considerateness, liberality, for instance. Terms that deal with feelings that aren't necessary to transactions. Each of these makes life better when justice is also present. But that's exactly my point. I'm not here to badmouth justice. I'm here to talk about what's beyond it. Or at least this is one of my points, since my most ambitious argument is that the ethical terrain includes a place where the transactional calculations common to everyday life fade entirely into the background, and where we encounter nothing but the exercise of grace. We are fools for the sake of Christ, St. Paul remarks in his first letter to Corinthians. Fools in the sense that grace makes it possible to set calculation aside and instead to act solely on the basis of goodwill to others. Let me draw on an example from the Christian Gospels to illustrate this. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus tells a story about someone from a scorned portion of the Judean population, a Samaritan, who performs an act of mercy that other higher status members of the community, a priest and a Levite, can't be bothered with. A traveler making the trip from Jerusalem to Jericho fell among thieves, Jesus says, and after robbing him, the thieves left him for dead. A priest who noticed the victim did nothing. Same with a Levite who later came that way. Then a Samaritan saw the victim. The Samaritan went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and water, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And on the next day, Jesus continues, before departing, the Samaritan took out 2 pennies and gave them to the host, and said unto him, "Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more when I come again, I will repay thee." I take this as a paradigmatic example of exceptionless grace, an example of conduct that transcends the bounds of wary cooperation. The thieves operate in the domain of justice minus. The priest and Levi can't be faulted as far as justice is concerned. They're within the justice zone, though only barely so. And the Samaritan ventures to the nether region of justice plus. His conduct is, of course, compatible with the requisites of justice. But to note this is to dwell on a peripheral point. The Samaritan isn't a wary cooperator. He doesn't calculate the likely benefits of his conduct. Rather, he acts selflessly to help a stranger in need. Now, I've just alerted you to my map of the ethical terrain, the map I'm going to use in the remainder of this talk to discuss our three fictional characters and the one from real life. I should add, though, that this may not be St. Paul's map. After all, the Galatians commentary on grace quoted earlier begins with the statement, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Remember, of course, there that what Paul is doing is quoting the Torah and then elaborating on it. Moreover, Jesus, in extending the framework Hillel adopted for interpreting the Torah's norm of reciprocity, begins the Good Samaritan parable by citing the thou shalt love thy neighbor passage in the Torah and by using it to answer the question, and who is my neighbor? So it's reasonable to say that St. Paul, in interpreting the Christian message, does not suggest a distinction between justice and grace, which is the distinction that I'm using. Reasonable, in other words, to say that on Paul's account, the priest and Levi were also unjust, and so to classify the Samaritan's conduct as merely just. I think this is a plausible reading of St. Paul's position. Even if it's compatible with Paul's thought, though, I have to add that I don't find it convincing. I reject it because I think my map of the ethical terrain identifies something that's missing in the map I just outlined: the importance of identifying the boundary line between wary, self-interested reciprocity, that's justice, and the inclination to engage in acts without any expectation of reciprocity from others, that's grace. On my reckoning, the conceptual distinction I've just outlined affirms the difference between doing something and receiving something. Justice is concerned with desert. Someone has to do something in order to lay claim to desert, and thus for the concept of justice to come into play. In contrast, grace is understandable as an unearned benefit. It's something someone receives without doing anything. There is, however, a further reason why I insist on the distinction between justice and grace. This is because the Hebrew and Christian Bibles aren't systematically concerned with what we now call social justice. They touch on the dangers of oppression. Think, for example, about Pharaoh's subjugation of the Israelites, or of Jesus' many comments on the plight of the poor. This said, though, the Old and New Testaments don't come close to addressing the key concerns of the admittedly modern notion of social justice. Both accept the legitimacy of slavery, for example. Furthermore, each presupposes women's subordination to men. On my analysis, slavery and gender subordination are unjust. It isn't an act of grace to free a slave. Similarly, it isn't a matter of grace for a husband to treat his wife as an equal. These are requirements of justice. They aren't examples of justice plus, but instead of justice simpliciter. Now, to say this is to endorse an egalitarian conception of justice, a conception essential to modern thought, but one that's at best implicit in the Bible, perhaps even non-existent. Once we think about justice along these lines, we can say, along with John Rawls, that wary cooperators, reasoning behind a veil of ignorance, that's a Rawlsian term, as to their actual circumstances, would reject the institutions of slavery and male domination, while we can also say that there's something beyond justice, something that can be called grace, which seasons justice And there I'm stealing from Shakespeare and from Portia's speech in The Merchant of Venice. Okay? Something that relieves the anxieties of wary cooperation. It's because I view these points as critical that I'll draw on the justice-grace distinction when discussing our three fictional characters and one from real life in the remainder of my talk. So from here on, I'm going to start to talk about the fictional characters and then Nelson Mandela, applying what I've just said. Now, in talking about them, I'm going to propose the following classifications. Jane Bennet is amiable. SpongeBob is naive. Cordelia is wary yet selfless. And Nelson Mandela is all of the above, an extraordinary embodiment of human qualities, one that made it possible for him to contribute dramatically to the nonviolent conclusion of a political arrangement of profound injustice through the exercise of grace. Each character we'll consider is a study in grace. Each can, at least to a limited extent, be labeled a fool in the service of Christ, in particular because each responds without bitterness to the injustices of his or her life. Yet each is also a creature of dignity because of the way in which he or she responds to the vicissitudes of his or her situation. Okay, think first about Jane Bennet. My hunch is that her name is the least familiar of the four in my subtitle. If so, that's because readers of Pride and Prejudice focus on Jane's sister, Elizabeth Lizzie Bennet, not on Jane. I grant, of course, that Lizzie is the novel's heroine. I further grant that the novel lives on because Lizzie is a feminist icon, a young lady of modest background who insists on moral equality with Fitzwilliam Darcy, even though he is her social superior. But my focus is different. I'm concerned with the contrast between Lizzie's insistence on justice, her insistence on fair treatment by Darcy, for instance, and her indignation about the slights she suffers at the hands of others in her class-bound milieu, and Jane's grace in accepting routine injustice, plus her unwillingness to adopt Lizzie's stance in charging others with moral fault. The contrast is made clear near the beginning of Pride and Prejudice. My dear Jane, Lizzie exclaims to her sister as they talk in the intimacy of their home. You are too good. Your sweetness and disinterestedness are really angelic. I do not know what to say to you. I feel as if I have never done you justice or loved you as you deserve. The contrast persists throughout the novel. Lizzie bristles. She erupts in anger. She gives way to alarm when things go wrong, particularly when things go wrong because she misjudges someone. Now, George Wickham, for those of you who know the novel, is the prime example here. By considering Wickham morally worthy when he turns out to be a cad. Jane, on the other hand, looks for the best in everyone. Her mild and steady candor always pleaded for allowances, Austen writes, and urged the possibility of mistakes. Is Jane a fool then? Not a fool for the sake of Christ, but simply a deluded fool, a chump, in other words. The possibility can't be dismissed. Even at the novel's end, when Jane becomes engaged to the man she loves, and Lizzie becomes engaged to Darcy, Jane's father emphasizes Jane's chump-like innocence and also that of her fiancé while giving his blessing to the match. Here's what her father says. You're each of you so complying that nothing will ever be resolved on, so easy that every servant will cheat you, and so generous that you will always exceed your income. This, of course, won't be the case once Lizzie marries Darcy. They'll hold the servants to a strict standard. They'll never overspend their income. I think, though, that ultimately it's a mistake to dismiss Jane as a chump. On Austen's analysis, Jane exemplifies an often overlooked Christian virtue, the virtue of amiability. Lizzie most assuredly does not possess this virtue. Lizzie is scrupulously just. She's not only hard on others, she's hard on herself. Because she is, she's also somewhat frightening, judgmental rather than mild, critical rather than accepting. But Lizzie gets things done, whereas Jane is meek. Meekness is a sign of grace, according to St. Paul, you might remember. Nonetheless, we should add that Lizzie's quest for justice might be tiresome, and that Jane seasons her sister's quest for justice. I'm returning to Portia's helpful term here. On this reckoning, Jane's amiability is an essential component of the sisters' communal life, though Lizzie's fierce devotion to justice is indispensable in a world of ruthless self-interest. Now, when we turn to SpongeBob, and I'm not sure that a lot of you are acquainted with SpongeBob, I have my son Michael sitting here, who introduced me to SpongeBob about 10 years ago, and I am very grateful for the encounter. When we turn to SpongeBob, we're reminded of a further contrast. The difference between the masks of hypocrisy that often figure prominently in adult literature, phoniness is a recurrent theme of Pride and Prejudice, and the straightforward, unmasked behavior found in literature and TV shows for kids. This is one of the reasons why I'm so enamored of Stephen Hillenburg's TV creation, and why I'm discussing it in a talk that also deals with works by Jane Austen and William Shakespeare. Each character in Bikini Bottom, the locale of the series, is exactly what he appears to be. Squidward is a grouch. Mr. Krabs is an avaricious, exploitative capitalist. He pays SpongeBob ridiculously low wages to work in his fast food restaurant, the Krabby Patty. Plankton is a midget-sized, power-crazed megalomaniac. And SpongeBob is the innocent foil to each of them, always amiable. There's that Christian virtue again. Never embittered by others' efforts to subjugate him, but successfully resistant to those efforts, though he doesn't fight back against Mr. Krabs' exploitative arrangements, even though he resists attempts at outright domination by everyone else while preserving his cheerful outlook on life. Now, because SpongeBob appears in a TV show, there's no need for me to provide you with quoted passages. Instead, I'm going to play a short clip, thanks to my son Michael, who did this in conjunction with David Bland. I'm going to play you a short clip, one that consists of 5 encounters between the show's characters. One of the encounters, the second, involves Mr. Krabs and Plankton. In it, Mr. Krabs gloats over Plankton's inability to steal the recipe for Krabby Patties served in Mr. Krabs' restaurant, thus reinforcing Mr. Krabs' proclivity to practice the primitive accumulation of capital, to use Marxist terminology to analyze social relations in Bikini Bottom. In the other encounters, Plankton attempts to dominate SpongeBob, and SpongeBob rebuffs him while never losing his composure.
Okay.
Wait a second. Hold this. You're not small like me, Shorty. I am a towering 0.5 millimeter taller than you. I win! Look what you've done. This is my livelihood.
Sure it is. And this isn't the formula that you don't want. Come on, eh? Eh? Whoop, too slow.
Get out! You never had a chance to defeat me, fool. And you know why?
Because you cheated?
No, not because I cheated, because I'm an evil genius.
I can't believe you thought I was lying.
Hey, don't take it personally. I just assume everyone is lying.
That is a horrible way to live your life.
Whatever. You really did it this time, old Planky. Oh yeah, who's the genius? Have you seen this, seen this, seen this, seen my genius, genius, genius?
Well, sometimes you can get a little aggressive.
Me? Aggressive? How dare you! Well, what do we do now?
Now we work together. You know, teamwork.
What's TM work?
No, Plankton, teamwork.
TM work.
Teamwork.
Tie 'em work.
Teamwork.
Tie 'em up.
Say team, like a sports
Team.
team. Now say work.
Work.
Put them together, what do you got?
Time bomb. Work.
Getting better.
It's not.
Thank you. Needless to say, Plankton would not quite accept the notion of justice that I'm proposing here. Okay? And that's why I'm showing it to you. Teamwork, or rather, TM work, or perhaps just time bomb. Plankton views all cooperative activity as something for chumps. If you're a midget megalomaniac, you lie whenever it's convenient to do so, and you just assume that everyone else is lying too. SpongeBob's response, "That's a horrible way to live your life," is childishly naive, of course, but given his repeat encounters with the malevolent Plankton and others who are equally problematic, one begins to discern a certain willfulness in SpongeBob's refusal to see the worst in everyone else. His is a defiant kind of grace, and so too is Jane Bennet's. Of course, Plankton isn't interested in the fair terms of cooperation. Of course, Plankton's transition from teamwork to time bomb underscores his significance as a creature who inhabits the justice minus side of the ethical terrain. But the message of SpongeBob SquarePants the show, and arguably the message of Pride and Prejudice the novel, is that a stubborn commitment to grace is admirable in a world of outright knaves. Grace has its own integrity, even in the face of injustice. If this is the message of SpongeBob and Jane, it takes on a darker hue when we turn to Cordelia. The final scenes of Shakespeare's play make this clear, as Cordelia dies while trying to save her father. But even the opening scenes are darker than anything we've considered so far. For Cordelia, unlike our other two characters, doesn't delude herself about her sister's cunning. Evil threatens SpongeBob and Jane, but they evade its worst effects while refusing to consider the malevolence of those around them. Cordelia, on the other hand, is the victim of malevolence, and before it destroys her, and it does destroy her, she sees it for what it is and stands up to it with defiant grace. Hearing her sisters Goneril and Regan engage in transparently false professions of love when their father summons all three of them to divide his kingdom, Cordelia refuses to join in their obsequious flattery, saying that she isn't a practitioner of the glib and oily arts. That alone is worth the price of admission. I'm a lawyer. I am a practitioner of the glib and oily arts. Given her asides, the audience already knows that she's the only one who's truly devoted to Lear, but that her integrity holds her back from mimicking her sisters. Thus, Cordelia, the only one of the sisters who's still unmarried, loses a suitor, the Duke of Burgundy, because she has no dowry to offer. Another suitor, the King of France, still wants her, however, and wants her precisely because of what she is. I quote here, marvelous statement from the fairest Cordelia, thou art most rich for being poor, most choice for being forsaken, and most loved, despised. Thee and thy virtues here I seize upon. Grace, along with clear-eyed understanding of malice in the world, this is something we don't find in Jane Bennet or in SpongeBob, yet it's essential to Cordelia's character. As she leaves dowryless Lear's court to marry the King of France, it appears that her virtue has actually found its own reward. And she says to her sisters, "The jewels of our father, with washed eyes Cordelia leaves you. I know you what you are. and like a sister am most loath to call your faults as they are named. Now all of this occurs in Act 1. In Acts 2 and 3, with Cordelia absent, Lear descends into madness as Goneril and Regan engage in what we would now call elder abuse. When she returns in Act 4, Cordelia does so to save her father from the suffering he's experienced at his daughter's hands. Again, I'm quoting, "No blown ambition doth in our arms incite," Cordelia says, "but love, dear love, and our aged father's right." And when Lear, by now pathetic Lear, debased by his older daughter's depredations, eventually regains the power to recognize her, he apologizes abjectly. "Be your tears wet? Yes, Faith. I pray weep not," he says. "If you have poison for me, I will drink it. I know you do not love me, for your sisters have, as I remember, done me wrong. You have some cause. They do not." Well, at this point, someone reasoning from the standpoint of justice would agree. Indeed, Cordelia, having good cause, again from the standpoint of justice, not even to return from France, her father having denied her a dowry, could have used the occasion to emphasize the degree to which she had been wronged. That would be just. But Cordelia lives beyond justice. Her brief response captures the dignity of grace even in the face of humiliation. "No cause, no cause," Cordelia says. No cause? Of course there was cause, just cause. And wouldn't Cordelia know this? Given her clear-eyed assessment of her sisters, in this respect she sees the world as unsentimentally as Elizabeth Bennet does, it seems reasonable to attribute to her an awareness of the possibility of voicing just grievances against her father. But grievance is not a component of grace. Even forgiveness may not be a component, for Cordelia appears not even to consider the wrongfulness, and wrongfulness is a part of the vocabulary of justice, not of grace, of her father's prior folly. All that matters is her devotion to him, her willingness to sacrifice her life to protect him, and sacrifices it she does. The audience doesn't witness her death, rather it hears Lear cry out in agony just before his death as he mourns hers. "A plague upon you murderers, traitors all," Lear exclaims. "I might have saved her, now she's gone forever. Cordelia, Cordelia, stay a little." Grace is not rewarded then. Instead, the exercise of grace leads to sacrifice and ultimately death. We can't discount this possibility. Jane Bennet's fate is too good to be true. SpongeBob, well, he has no fate. He's part of a children's show, and he just keeps chugging along, cheerfully, of course. So Cordelia's death underscores the perils of grace, and it underscores the indispensability of wary cooperation in a world defined by past acts of predatory injustice. Given these points, the outcome of Nelson Mandela's life may also seem too good to be true. It may seem that as far as Mandela was concerned, a Jane Bennet-type ending was highly unlikely, and a Cordelia-type death quite probable. We all know how things actually turned out. So in my concluding remarks, I'll note, if only briefly, how Mandela, a wary cooperator in his dealings with the white Afrikaner power structure, seasoned justice. Now I admit that I'm bewitched by Portia's term from Merchant of Venice. Seasoned justice with personal grace, thereby averting the bloodbath everyone feared. Think first about Mandela, the wary cooperator. In this guise, Mandela never took his eyes off the imperatives of justice. The passage is in the sheet I gave you. At his Rivonia trial that led to his 27-year imprisonment on an island in the South Atlantic, Mandela stated, "It is not I, but the government that should be in the dock. I plead not guilty." Now this, of course, is the vocabulary of justice. We wouldn't be talking about Mandela today were it not for his contribution to ending political injustice. Anthony Sampson, Mandela's very insightful biography, it's a very good book, captures the structural considerations that Mandela and his Afrikaner counterpart, F.W. de Klerk, had to take into account in negotiating the end of apartheid during the early 1990s. I quote here, Mandela and de Klerk both accepted the basic logic behind any peace talks, that they couldn't win by force of arms without intolerable loss of life. Mandela was still convinced, as he had been in jail, that a military victory was a distant if not impossible dream. De Klerk told diplomats that he thought he could retain power if necessary for 10 years, but the casualties would be too heavy. They had both looked into the abyss, and Mandela faced the most demanding task of his career, to negotiate a peaceful revolution without a violent backlash from the white right or the black left. Now, Sampson uses the language of prudence here, prudence on behalf of justice, with justice understood in terms of the paramount value of bloodbath avoidance, even when many of the people whose blood might be shed have benefited from injustice. This point has nothing to do with grace. Rather, it underscores the inescapable importance of justice in establishing fair terms of cooperation. In this instance, fair terms when establishing a framework for dismantling injustice. It's arguable, certainly I would argue this, that the project of dismantling historic injustice is the most urgent worldwide issue of our day. Whatever stand someone might take on this claim of priority, though, it's manifest that the imperative Mandela and de Klerk accepted is understandable in terms of the point we glean from Jeremy Waldron at the outset, that no one is beyond justice. But grace adds to justice. It makes justice more palatable, more acceptable, particularly when the issue is how to dismantle injustice. And here Mandela's grace comes into play. Indeed, it's here that we can bring back Max Weber's use of the word charisma, for Mandela used his natural gifts. Yes, St. Paul and Max Weber converge on this point, to oversee the transition from apartheid to multiracial democracy. What were those gifts? Start out with something that wasn't present in Mandela, his lack of bitterness. A person committed to justice is entitled to be bitter about the injustice done to her. This person is entitled to a sense of grievance, in other words. Mandela suffered profound injustice, yet he never expressed bitterness about this. Almost all the comrades I served with in prison have come out without any sense of bitterness, Mandela once remarked. If you were in prison, you would never find the time to be bitter because you were looking at problems. Well, I beg to differ here. Indeed, I would sympathize with anyone who endured lengthy imprisonment for unjust cause. But of course, I realize that the fictional characters, Jane, Bennet, and Cordelia, never express bitterness about the injustices they suffer, and I see Mandela as exhibiting similar grace in real life. Now consider not an absence, but a presence, the magical, inward composure that attracts followers, even if the followers' inclinations might lead them in a different direction. Very hard to make sense of this. I've fallen back on the cliched word magic in trying to deal with it. But while charisma eludes analysis, or perhaps it just eludes me given my shortcomings in writing, its presence can easily be discerned. Anthony Sampson, Mandela's biographer, identified its effect when he remarked on the devotion Mandela's white Afrikaner bodyguards felt for him. Once elected to the presidency, Sampson reports, Mandela became friendly with his bodyguards, whose loyalty could be seen in their anxious faces as they watched his movements. I used to do it for the money. Now it's for him, said one of the bodyguards. I'd take the bullet for him. Did this inward grace promote the transition to democratic justice in South Africa? I think so. Indeed, this is the unifying point of my talk. But rather than try to further this claim on my own, I'll rely on a comment by Joe Slovo, a white South African who belonged to the South African Communist Party in the 1960s, but who later became one of Mandela's most devoted supporters in the African National Congress. Without Mandela, South African history would have taken a completely different turn, Slovo remarked. And that's not just because of his charisma or status, but basically because of his leadership on Robben Island, where he, Slovo, and other leaders of the liberation movement were imprisoned throughout the 70s and 80s. It is a fact that it was he who triggered the negotiations. Oliver Tambo was absolutely irreplaceable. He kept the organization, he kept people together. But when it came to facing the post-1990 period, the role of Mandela is absolutely unique. Not merely charisma, Slovo states, but rather charisma in conjunction with a clear assessment, clear-eyed assessment of the claims of justice. If we put it this way, I think we've identified the highest gifts a human being can possess. I've started with fictional characters, but I'm ending with someone from real life, someone whose traits can helpfully be considered through the prism of literature, but whose features are astonishing because they were beheld in the context of life as it was actually lived.
Wow. Bill, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. And we will now have time for questions. Please ask a question. Do not make a long statement. Keep questions to a minute or less. We'd like to hear from new voices, persons who might not have asked questions in the past. For those of you on Zoom, we will alternate between the room and Zoom for questions, beginning with 2 questions from the room. If you want to put questions in the chat window, instead of asking them yourself, we'll be taking questions that way too, although it is sometimes hard for us to see if the message is in the chat room. I will ask the first question. I'm not even sure it's a question. My head was spinning as you talked about the grace of Mandela and how that created a leader out of him. When I think of what's going on with us now, I don't know if you can apply it. But it seems now that people are drawn not to grace, but to victimization and that kind of thing. Is there a way, or is this just too difficult to apply that to what's going on here now?
Is there a way? I wish there were.
Yeah.
Let me just tell you that it seems to me that what I'm talking about is, of course, profoundly relevant to today.
Yeah.
And let me put it in terms of a word that I don't use in the talk: leeway. It seems to me that if you agree with me, and you don't have to, that dismantling the structure of historic injustice is one of, if not the most urgent issue in our day, leeway is going to be required on both sides. On the one hand, we are not going to be able to provide full compensation for the victims of the accumulated wrongs of human history. And on the other hand, the beneficiaries of those accumulated wrongs are going to have to grant leeway in yielding the advantages that they have. And each of those, I would say, is a component of grace, because I don't think that the kind of precise calculations essential to justice are going to work here. I think that we instead must grant leeway to both sides. And now here I am, a man in his 70s, sort of a classic left liberal of a long time back, and deeply disturbed about identity politics and the victimhood that comes with it. But on the other hand, probably even more disturbed by populist authoritarianism. Now, both of those are bad, and each of them are addressed by people who grant leeway to others. But that leeway is in some way or other understandable in terms of this notion of grace.
Thank you so much. Once again, we're going to alternate between the meeting house and the people on Zoom. We'll start by taking questions from 2 people in the meeting house. I'll hand it over to the Zoom coordinator. After that, we'll hand it over to Mark.
So I was wondering about how you see the relationship between law. I was wondering about what I was wondering about how you see the relationship between love, compassion, and grace. Because the way I was thinking about it is like grace is very similar to having an insight into compassion and love, and that the grace comes from.
Well, these are all related. They're all related. But go back to my initial remarks. If justice is a term for wary cooperators, if justice is the concept we use for thinking about 2 of the essential subjects in first-year law school, contracts and torts, in particular about torts, where we think about a fender bender as the way of trying to overcome a wrong by calculating the exact to the penny amount that is due when that car rear-ended you, and having a payment along those lines, and say that this is justice, then I'm talking about something that is different. And I don't think that compassion quite captures this, because when that car rear-ended my car, I'm not going to ask, I don't think I should be asked to be compassionate to the car that rear-ended me. I think that justice may be the right factor. What I'm trying to do here generally, and what your question takes us to, is the vocabulary of right conduct, and then the vocabulary that takes us beyond right conduct to think about the generosity, the leeway that we grant others. Compassion is one part of it, but compassion carries with it a notion of pity. And love is really fundamentally different because we've let down our guard almost altogether. Remember that I'm concerned here with relations between strangers, the leeway that strangers grant one another. They don't have to love each other. They can, and they do all of this in the shadow of justice or of injustice. They are aware of injustice. They don't necessarily love each other, but they recognize that they are the beneficiaries or the losers of historic struggles. This is really at the core of Mandela's mission. And the losers don't ask for the full measure of justice. Measure is a very important word to use here. Measure, because justice is frequently about measurement. And the winners yield what they have, even though they have perhaps lived proper lives, just lives themselves. It was their ancestors who achieved this. And it seems to me that leeway is the modern non-theological term, and grace is what lurks behind all of this, is what we are fundamentally concerned with. Not that I have any answer as to how we can bring this about, but all I'm trying to do is to work out the vocabulary for it. Nothing else. Nothing else. I just sit in my room typing this stuff up.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, then I will hand this over to the Zoom coordinator. Any questions there?
Thanks, Gwen. I remind people to please use their electronic hand raising. And we have Teresa Foreman. Please unmute and ask your question.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks for an interesting talk, Bill. You mentioned, some very high-profile examples of grace beyond the justice zone. And Nelson Mandela's actions are extraordinary. His particular circumstances were perhaps extraordinary. But I'm interested in what you think about the typical person. Do you think the typical person has the kind of grace beyond the justice zone that you're talking about. And although their life is much less prominent than Nelson Mandela, and it hasn't been captured in a book.
Well, Teresa, first, it's so good to see you from afar, and your friend Mark is here. Okay? I have no answer, no convincing answer. Let's deal with two of the most respected political figures. This is going to be a pessimistic comment in the long run. Two of the most pessimistic figures in the history of democratic politics. Mandela is one, and Lincoln the other. Mandela exercised extraordinary grace, but he has the effect for South African blacks has been a degree of poverty that is pretty much the same as the poverty that exists throughout the rest of the continent. The victims of historic wrongs due to the Afrikaners are not particularly different. He brought about political realignment, and he did so with grace, but he didn't attempt to bring about any kind of economic readjustment. And what's more, I'll get to Lincoln in a second, what's more, Mandela did it by being celebrated as a world-class leader, so that while Mandela himself showed grace, he also did it in the company of Hollywood and the Clintons and all the rest. You read Sampson's biography, and you realize that Mandela was overwhelmed when people like Brad Pitt came to visit him. It was something for him, so that he was elevated as his followers weren't. Now, look at Lincoln. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Look at that in terms of his refusal to be embittered by what the South had done, because that's from his second inaugural, from only 5 weeks before his assassination, which of course he didn't know was coming. Okay? And Lincoln's inclination was to sell out the former slaves in terms of land redistribution in order to reconcile, to grant leeway to the former rebels. Now, that shows you just how difficult the rectification, the correction of historic injustice is going to be. It is already. It's underway. You asked me about what's going on in America. I would tell you the very simplest answer is that in about 40 to 50 years ago, the South flipped. It turned entirely Republican, and the North turned largely Democrat. What's going on here? What's going on here is the heritage of historic wrong and the extraordinary difficulty that America and the rest of the world face in coming to terms with the structure of historic injustice. I have no simple answer. I think that instead, people like Mandela, Obama, Lincoln show grace, but bear in mind the limits of what can be asked of the people who have benefited from historic wrongs over the years. Okay? I will put it to you in a different sense that is not discussed here, that I certainly didn't discuss at all. I think a lot, I doubt that any of the rest of you do, I think a lot about the McGirt case. What's the McGirt case? 5-4 decision with Neil Gorsuch going over to from the conservatives to the lib side, and Ruth Ginsburg still alive. So it was 4 plus Neil Gorsuch, dealing with the treaties that Congress made with the Creeks, who were evicted from Georgia and did the terrible long march from Georgia to Oklahoma. Now, what does McGirt bring about? Well, everybody who lives, all the white people who now live in eastern Oklahoma are potentially subject to the jurisdiction of Creek courts because the court held that those treaties are binding on it. Historic wrongs? Absolutely. Might it mean that a Creek court would favor a Native American criminal defendant over the family of a white victim? Yes, it could. And I'm not sure that that's a good thing. And it might be said that it's a particularly troubling thing because here we have white families that have lived not as predators against Creeks, but in a perfectly just way for 100 years or so. And we have to come to terms with that kind of extraordinarily complicated heritage of historic wrongs. And all I can tell you is the spirit of Jane Bennet, SpongeBob, and Cordelia matters here, but heaven knows that I don't know how that spirit is going to be infused into us. I have no answer as to that. But I do think that the fictional characters are pertinent here. And I think that one way or another, the notion of grace is pertinent.
Well, I think we had one question from the room. Let's have a second. Diane?
I feel like this sort of personal quality of amiability, patience, open-mindedness is not given power in our current social media universe. It's good for a laugh for a half a second on commercial television maybe, but everything out there seems to give strength and power and visibility and glamour to these really rough, angry, sharp-edged emotions and styles of communication. So I wonder if, in a sneaky way, if there was a way to give more value, more power, more credit to this kind of a personal style and negotiation style than it now receives. I don't know how you do that, but
well,
it feels like you need to counterbalance this universe of bad examples that's set before us time and time and time again.
Okay, so whatever I say is going to be basically agreeing with you, and I'll just try to turn it on you libs for a moment. Now, I'm a lib too, but let's understand that first, what Jane Bennet stands for is powerlessness. And what Pride and Prejudice then stands for is a fantasy ending that ends in marriage to a nice rich man who himself is something of a chump. Because when we're talking about grace, we're talking about amiability that is then not powerful, okay? When we're talking about identity politics on college campuses, and heaven knows I come from those, but that's another interesting story of a different kind. When we're talking about identity politics on college campuses, the remedy for powerlessness is understood to be anger and indignation. And the remedy for injustice is understood to be anger and indignation. And what am I talking about with all of these? What does Cordelia do? Instead of being indignant about what her father did to her, she comes back and serves him. So I take all of this to be part of a very, very, how would we put it, unsettling critique of the indignation of the powerlessness, of the powerless. But it could only be possible if those with power show themselves to be willing to be graceful, and I am not convinced that that's going to happen. And so instead, we have Jews for Justice in Palestine all over Ivy League campuses saying that the people in power will show us no respect. And I can't fault them entirely for that either. Surely this is a terrible kind of cycle. So I'm agreeing with you. But understand that amiability comes with powerlessness. Amiability comes with dealing with people in power in an unthreatening way.
What about civil disobedience? Isn't that?
Yeah.
Can you see a civil disobedience as a gesture of power if it's
Well, I'll
very
give you
disciplined?
two options. First, would you say that civil disobedience would be possible against Putin? No. Why was Gandhi's civil disobedience possible? Because he was preying on people like me. He was preying on people like me who were capable of guilt and were going to oppose the exercise of violence against him. Now, give me a certain point in human history, and of course I want civil disobedience. Martin Luther King and Gandhi could do it, but that's only because there was a certain point in human history. The Red Rose, if you know the Red Rose, those were the brave young people who demonstrated against Hitler in Munich in 1942 and were shot the next day. Not possible. It is a dynamic that we're all concerned with. But I think that, I don't know, maybe this room, maybe there are people who are going to disagree with me. My sense is that we have gone too far in terms of identity politics and indignation. And what I am talking up here is something different, but it requires adjustment on both sides. And I'm not convinced that we have it. Now, that's why I started with fiction. And that's why, bear in mind that Mandela, you revere Mandela, I revere Mandela, you have Mandela out there in the lobby, okay? You revere him. But bear in mind that up until the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher would have nothing to do with Mandela and treated him as nothing but a terrorist, okay? It was the collapse of the Soviet Union that made that so much more possible. It was a historical moment that could be grasped. Okay, so here I am, much more Cordelia than Jane Bennet or SpongeBob. I'm clear-eyed at the same time that I'm trying to talk about what can be done.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a question on Zoom. Susan?
Thank you. William Graves, please unmute and ask your question.
You hear much these days about the principle that no man is above the law. And I'm just wondering how you would set that against another principle that no person is beyond justice. And what's the difference?
Well, I'll give you a very straightforward difference and turn it around as a question for you. Nelson Mandela was placed on trial in 1963 for violating the laws by opposing apartheid. For he was tried for a crime that existed in the 18th century, seditious libel. That was a law adopted by the parliament in Johannesburg. Would you say that that was a just law? I imagine you would say no. Then I'd say that this is a case of civil disobedience that was not as bad as the Red Rose. The white Afrikaner power structure couldn't crush him. But on the other hand, he was speaking up for political justice against a law, a properly enacted law, a duly enacted law of the Union of South Africa that was unjust. And I guess that's how I would answer your question. And I would say that when Frederick Douglass ran away to the north, the law said that he was contraband and illegal, and I would say that he was a person who could claim justice against the law. Now that goes to your civil disobedience question. Frederick Douglass did that in the 1850s. And in the 1850s, there were enough people in the North who could have supported him. Would that have been true in the 1750s? Probably not. So we have to grab historical moments, and this is part of my progressive reading of history, that this could happen then.
But should we be pushing for justice rather than simply the law?
Yes, but bear in mind that let me give you, this is now a major industry in the academic world where I sort of live. The history of opposition to slavery, the anti-slavery movement is very, very well documented by now. And we find, I am not aware of any Christian sect that today treats slavery as acceptable. I am not aware of any Christian sect from 1,800 years ago that treated slavery as unacceptable. We are talking now about vast and tremendously important historical changes. And that is one of the many reasons why I would not call myself a Christian fundamentalist. Okay? Why I would instead say that our concepts of justice properly changed. I gave 2 examples of it during the talk. Okay? So that when we're talking about justice, it may be that our abstract definitions of justice can be similar from 2,000 years ago, but our concrete applications have properly changed, and our understanding of justice has to change. We have to grant that. Okay? All of these then are components of what I've been discussing in the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions, and given the time, I'm going to, we're going to conclude. Are we having music at